welcome back in. Today we're discussing our Week 11 must-start plays at every single position. We're going to go with the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Let's go ahead and get to it. And we're going to start with our top quarterback plays of the week. We're going to start with Justin Herbert versus the Jaguars. Justin Herbert is having his best fantasy season since 2021 when he was the QB2, averaging 23.3 fantasy points per game. This season, Herbert averages a very healthy 36 pass attempts per game, which ranks second. He's also second in passing yards and third in passing touchdowns, and is the QB6 overall. Herbert's rushing ability has been on full display this season as he leads all quarterbacks in rushing yards with 324. However, he did pick up what looked like a high ankle sprain, and they're winning against the Steelers on Sunday Night Football. We could see him be a little bit limited on the ground moving forward. I do think Herbert in the passing offense left some meat on the bones as well, as his 67% completion percentage ranks 16th, and he also ranks 19th in EPA per dropback. I will say their injuries to their offensive line has been a really big problem this year as well. Herbert is constantly under duress. On the positive front, though, that for this week, this matchup against the Jags should be a positive one for the Chargers in their passing attack. The Jags are not a team that gets pressure on quarterbacks. They are tied for dead last with the Ravens and 49ers with just 12 sacks this year. The Jags are currently allowing 261.7 passing yards and 2.33 touchdowns per game, are both fourth most, and their 23.2 fantasy points per game is the second most fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Dak Prescott versus the Raiders. This game between the Raiders and Cowboys is a matchup that has the highest total of the weekend with a 50.5 point total. Both defenses rank among the worst in the league. The Cowboys allowed the second most points per game at 30.8, and the Raiders are 10th, allowing 24.4 points per game. As far as Dak's concerned, the Cowboys rank fourth in pass attempts and second in pace of play. Dak ranks sixth in passing yards and seventh in passing touchdowns. His 19.4 fantasy points per game ranks 10th. He's also been highly efficient, ranking 8th in EPA per dropback and 9th in completion percentage. Recently, we have seen a bit of a fall from this offense after 4 straight weeks of scoring 23 or more fantasy points from weeks 4 through 7. However, over his last 2 starts against the Broncos and Cardinals, he scored just 8.6 and 16.4. This should be a bounce back spot as the Cowboys are 3.5 point favorites and have the 4th highest implied team total for week 11. I am back on Dak train again this week. Let's keep it moving. And we're going to talk about some other quarterbacks that might be available on waivers that I think are definitely great plays. First is going to be Joe Flacco. Since coming over to Cincinnati, Flacco has posted 3 straight games, 24 or more fantasy points. He's averaging 313 passing yards, 2.75 touchdowns, and 25.5 fantasy points in the 4 games he started with the Bengals, which would be the QB1 over that span. If you would have told me a month ago that Joe Flacco would be a top 12 quarterback play for me in week 11, I would have laughed at you, but well, here we are. Fresh off their bye, the Bengals travel to Pittsburgh to take on a Steelers pass defense that allows 299 passing yards and 1.75 touchdowns per game to opposing QBs. Flacco will be a top 10 quarterback play for me this week. Let's keep it moving. And let's move over to Jacoby Brissett versus the 49ers. Much like Flacco, Brissett has been a big surprise. Over the last 4 games, he's averaged 21.4 fantasy points per game, which ranks top 5 over that span. The Cardinals have been extremely pass-heavy since Brissett has taken over, as he's dropped back 38 times per game, which is a plus for fantasy output. One thing that hurts is the loss of Marvin Harrison, who underwent surgery on Wednesday with appendicitis. Trey McBride was already seeing elite wide receiver 1 usage. He now might go to another stratosphere with Marv being out. Next up for the Cardinals is an extremely banged up 49ers defense that has fallen off a cliff recently. They allow the 8th most passing yards, the 5th most touchdowns, and the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. We ride again with Jacoby Brissett as a borderline top 12 quarterback play. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers has been completely touchdown dependent. He's only scored 20 fantasy points twice this season. Both came when he threw 4 touchdowns. Well, one of those games came against the Bengals, who the Steelers host this weekend. The Bengals have one of the worst defenses in the league. Only DJ Turner has been a bright spot for this group, who has done a nice job shutting down outside wide receivers. Good news for the Steelers is they rely heavily on multiple tight end sets. The recipe for success the last time these 2 teams squared off, the Bengals allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but allowed the most fantasy points against tight ends. Rodgers is certainly risky, and game script will largely depend on if he gets there this week. But I still think he should be considered as a top 15 quarterback play based solely on matchup and this game environment, as the game is tied for the second highest total on the slate this weekend. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to the running back position, and we're going to start with Chase Brown. Last time we saw Chase Brown on the field, he played 95% of the snaps and ran 84% of the routes. It was targeted 14 times after Samaje Perine went down early in the first quarter against the Bears. This is insane usage. It's something we haven't seen from Chase Brown since last year when Zach Moss went down. P. Ryan suffered a high ankle sprain and sounds unlikely to play this week, which is great news for Chase Brown and his fantasy upside. Brown is also riding a 3-game stretch, racking up over 100 yards in each game. Over that same span, he's averaging 19.2 PPR points, which ranked top 5. With this type of role, Brown is a weekly top 12 running back as long as P. Ryan is out. Let's keep moving. And we're going to move over to the other running back on the other side of that game, and that's Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren is quietly putting together one of the best seasons since entering the league. He's averaging 14.1 carries, 3.5 targets per game while playing about 60% of the snaps. As a receiver, he's also been credible with his 9.3 yards per reception, which ranks top 5, and his 2.06 yards per route run ranks second among running backs despite running just 38% of the routes. He's been consistent as a fantasy producer. He's been a top 24 scorer in 6 of 8 games and has been an RB1 performer in 3 of those 8 games as well. Next up for Jaylen Warren is a rematch against the Bengals where he totaled 158 total yards on 20 touches. The Bengals allow a ridiculous 141 rushing yards, any touchdown per game to running backs, and allow the most fantasy points to opposing running backs, making Warren a top 12 option. Keep moving. Let's move over to TreVeyon Henderson. And yes, it finally happened. Henderson finally had his breakout game. Last week, Henderson played 82% of the snaps and ran 75% of the routes. He totaled 150 yards and 2 scores for 28 PPR points. Crazy what happens when they finally rode their rookie second-round pick. Henderson looked explosive, and he reached 22 miles an hour on his long touchdown, which is the highest speed for any ball carrier this season. This week, Henderson will once again be in a prime spot with Ramondre Stevenson out. The Jets have been middle of the road against running backs this year. They've allowed the 10th most rushing yards. However, their 6 touchdowns ranked 17th, and overall, they have allowed the 17th most PPR points to running backs. With his workload for Henderson, he should be viewed as a locked-in, high-end RB2 against the Jets. Let's move over to Woody Marks. Maybe, hopefully, possibly, Woody Marks is the Texans' lead back after playing 81% of the snaps last week. He had 14 carries and saw 3 targets. He turned that into 81 total yards and a touchdown against the Jags. It's obvious that Marks is their best running back, and hopefully the coaching staff has figured that out. Either way, we have seen Woody Marks post top 15 numbers in 4 of his last 6 games. Marks has been efficient on the ground and through the air as he ranks 14th in yards per touch, 1st in yards per reception, and 11th in yards per route run. On the ground, he's also 9th in yards after contact per attempt and 24th in missed tackles 4th per attempt. This week, Marks and the Texans traveled to Tennessee to take on a Titans defense that has allowed 114.3 rushing yards and nearly 1.5 touchdowns per game to running backs. Overall, they have allowed the 6th most PPR points to running backs. Marks is also a high-end RB2 play for me this week. Let's keep moving here and let's move over to Aaron Jones. Even at nearly 31 years old, Aaron Jones still looks like the Vikings' best running back option. Last week against the Ravens, Aaron Jones played 72% of the snaps and was given 12 total touches. He turned that into 69 yards and a score for 15.9 PPR points. Now, this was mostly a trailing game script as the Vikings lost to the Ravens. Next up for Aaron Jones is another home matchup against the Bears defense that allows the 13th most PPR points. I like Aaron Jones, a solid RB2 play. Let's move over to some of our flex options. First, we're going to start with RJ Harvey. Now, this is mostly an opportunity play. J.K. Dobbins looks like he's going to miss some time after he got rolled up on last Thursday against the Raiders. Now, I will say the Chiefs have been mostly strong against opposing running backs as they have allowed the 7th fewest points to running backs this season. But even with Sean Payton and his unpredictable nature, I can't see him not feeding RJ Harvey as their lead back when you consider all they have are scat backs like Tyler Bidet and Jaleel McLaughlin. So while this is a tough matchup for RJ Harvey, I do think that opportunity should be enough to at least get him there as being a low-end RB2. Let's keep it moving. Move over to Emari Demercado. Bam Knight left last week's game against the Seahawks with an ankle injury. It also doesn't sound like Trey Benson will be activated this week. As Jonathan Gannon said, he's still day-to-day on Wednesday, and they have not activated him from IR. Both don't go. That leaves Michael Carter and Emari Demercado. I prefer Demercado of the two as he looked like their best running back. He's totaled 80 or more yards in 3 of their last 4 games. The Cardinals will face a 49ers defense that allowed the 14th most PPR points and have really struggled against pass-catching backs as they've allowed the 11th most receiving yards and the 3rd most receiving touchdowns, which fits Demercado, who profiles as the pass-catching back in this offense. Demercado, I think, is a solid flex play with possible RB2 upside. Let's move over to Kareem Hunt. It looks like Kareem Hunt will once again be the team's lead back this week with Isaiah Pacheco looking unlikely to play against the Broncos. The last time we saw Hunt before the week 10 bye, he handled 78% of the snaps, 48% of the routes. He finished with 12 total touches, 55 yards, and a score. The Broncos have been stingy against the run this year, allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs. They have been vulnerable to pass-catching backs, allowing the 15th most receiving yards and tied for the 3rd most receiving touchdowns. Hunt is the preferred 3rd down back. We'll see a majority of the touches in the red zone. I do think Kareem Hunt is probably a decent flex option despite this being a tough matchup. Lastly, let's talk about Sean Tucker. We have slowly started to see Sean Tucker earn more of the work the last few weeks. He's playing 35% of the snaps and averaging 11 touches per game. He's racked up 40 or more yards in each of the last 2 games and found the end zone once. The Bucs will travel to Buffalo on Sunday, where the weather is looking like it could be a heavy run script. We are still 4 days out, but currently we are looking at 20 to 25 mile an hour sustained winds with gusts up to 40 miles per hour. If that holds, it will definitely affect the passing game, which could lead to more work for the running backs. It should be mentioned that Bucky Irving returned to practice today, but it sounds like there's a much better chance he returns in week 12 than week 11. This is a strong matchup for running backs, as the Bills have struggled against running backs all year, allowing the 7th most PPR points to the position. Tucker is a volatile play, but does provide some upside. Let's move over to wide receivers. We're going to start with Lad McConkey. Remember when everyone was saying Lad McConkey was the Chargers' number 3 wide receiver through the first month of the year? Yeah, that looks pretty laughable now. McConkey is the wide receiver 4 overall, averaging 15.9 PPR points per game. Over that span, he's averaged 7.8 targets, 72 receiving yards, and half a touchdown per game. He's also been heavily targeted in the red zone with 17 targets, which ranks top 8 among wide receivers. He's also been very good after the catch with his 5.07 yards after the catch per reception, which ranks 18th. It should keep things rolling this week with an awesome matchup on tap against a Jags pass defense that allows the 8th most PPR points to wide receivers. Let's keep it moving. Let's move over to Jaylen Waddle. And Waddle has been on an absolute heater since Tyreek Hill went down in week 4. Since week 4, he's averaging 7 targets, 80.8 receiving yards, 0.75 touchdowns, and just over 15.9 PPR points, and has been the wide receiver 6. However, if you take out that one game against Cleveland where the weather was actually brutal, he's actually averaging 19 PPR points or is the wide receiver 2 overall. Simply put, Waddle has been elite and now gets an elite matchup this week against the Commanders team that allows the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Let's keep moving. Move over to T. Higgins. Sticking with a theme of the week with wide receivers that have struggled through the first 4 weeks. T. Higgins fits that bill as he was averaging just 8.1 PPR points through the first 5 weeks of the year. However, Joe Flacco took over, and now he's averaging 19.3 PPR points. He's averaging 7.2 targets, 5 receptions, 80 receiving yards, and nearly a touchdown in all 4 of those games. Makes you wonder what T. Higgins would have done if Joe Burrow had stayed healthy. Either way, the good times should keep rolling as the Bengals take on a Steelers defense that is hemorrhages points to outside wide receiver at the highest rate in the league. T plays almost exclusively on the outside, as he only runs 12% of his routes all year from the slot. Overall, the Steelers allow the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, making T very much a borderline wide receiver 1 play for me. Next up is going to be A.J. Brown. I totally get it. I can hear you groan from here. A.J. Brown is having his worst season in his career. In fact, his 11.2 PPR points per game is 2 full points lower per game than his worst season as when he was a rookie, where he averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game. Through 8 games, he's 34th in targets, 41st at target per route run rate. To make matters worse, the Eagles are once again very run heavy as they're averaging just 29.6 pass plays per game, which makes it hard for any wide receiver to consistently put up fantasy points. So why A.J. Brown is a must start for me? Well, schematically, this sets up really well for A.J. Brown. We know that he's the man beater in this offense, where Devontae Smith is much more of the zone beater. A.J. Brown is elite against man coverage. He currently averages 0.92 fantasy points per route run against man coverage, but just 0.17 fantasy points per route run against zone, where Smitty is averaging 0.3 fantasy points against man coverage, but 0.7 fantasy points against zone coverage. So why does this matter this week? Well, the Lions run man coverage at the 4th highest rate in the league. Game script should also dictate that the Eagles throw the ball at a much higher rate. The Lions allow the 11th most PPR points to wide receivers. They have been very much a pass funnel because they allow the fewest fantasy points to running backs this week. So I do think A.J. Brown is in a good spot. Tons of volatility here for sure, but A.J. Brown, I still think, sets up really well in this matchup against the Lions. Speaking of the Lions, let's move over to Jameson Williams. Now, Dan Campbell took over as the primary play caller last week. It looked like it paid off pretty big. Now, it was against the Commanders' horrible secondary, but still encouraging nonetheless. He finished with 6 receptions on 7 targets and 119 receiving yards and scored 23.9 PPR points and finishes the wide receiver 2 overall in week 10. Now, we have seen spike weeks from JMO before, but I think even more encouraging than just the output was the way they utilized him. Instead of just utilizing him as a deep threat, they got the ball in his hands on slants and crossers and allowed him to utilize his yards after the catch ability. As long as this continues, then much better days are ahead for the speedy Jameson Williams. This week, the Lions travel to Philly on Sunday Night Football to take on the Eagles. This game has a healthy 47.5 point total, And the Eagles are more of a middle of the road against wide receivers, allowing the 15th most PPR points to wide receivers. Jameson is a borderline wide receiver 2 / wide receiver 3 play for me. Keep moving over to some of the flex options. First, we're going to talk about Tre Tucker. And Tre Tucker's first game with Jacoby Myers. He had a pretty underwhelming game, seeing just 3 targets, turning that into 2 catches for 28 yards. Now, that was against the Broncos on the road, so expectations should have already been low. But I do think this week will lend itself to a much better result, facing a Cowboys defense that allows the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. While Brock Bowers will definitely be the focal point of the offense, I think 5 to 7 targets is definitely in the range of outcomes for Tre Tucker, and certainly makes him a viable flex option. Let's move over to Troy Franklin versus the Chiefs. Speaking of the ugly game, Raiders and Broncos, Troy Franklin was the only pass catcher that paid off last week. He finished with 5 catches on 9 targets for 40 yards and a score for 15 PPR points. Over his last 4 games, he's averaging nearly 10 targets per game and has been a top 24 producer in 3 of those 4. Next up for the Broncos is a huge home matchup against the Chiefs, who are coming off their bye. The Chiefs typically try to take away a playmaker away. I would expect that to try to limit Courtland Sutton, which should leave opportunities for Franklin to capitalize. Franklin is a wide receiver 3 play for me. Keep moving. Let's move over to Luther Burden. Now, this is purely if DJ Moore is out this week. Luther Burden played a season high 45% of the snaps, so ran 55% of the routes. He finished with 51 yards on 3 catches. If DJ Moore misses, Luther Burden should see an increased role. If you watched that game, you saw how explosive Burden looked. Now, this should be a breakout game against the Vikings. Keep it moving. Move over to some tight ends. First, I want to talk about is Dalton Schultz. Last week against the Jags, he earned 11 targets. He caught 7 of them for 53 yards and a score for 18 PPR points. Schultz continues to be a safety valve for this offense that has been targeted 32 times over the last 4 weeks and is averaging 13.8 fantasy points over that span. Davis Mills looks like he will once again be the starter. Schultz has hyper-targeted Schultz and Nico Collins since taking over as the starting quarterback. Schultz is a low-end tight end 1 against the Titans. Keep moving over to Theo Johnson. Theo Johnson continues to stack usable weeks together. Last week, he caught 7 of 8 for targets for 75 yards and 14.5 PPR points. He has now scored 11 or more points in 5 of his last 7 games. Now, we have some changes coming to the Giants this week, as Jackson Dart has already been ruled out, and head coach Brian Dable was fired. Mike Kafka will take over as the interim head coach. Better news, though, is Jameson Winston will start in his place. Winston is a gunslinger and is a much better fantasy option than Russell Wilson. While the Packers defense has been solid, they have struggled against tight ends, as they have allowed the 12th most PPR points to tight ends, making Theo Johnson also a borderline tight end 1 play. Lastly, the Steelers tight ends. I think Jonnu Smith is a good play. He leads the team in routes, but Patty Fry isn't really far behind. Bengals are historically bad against tight ends. They've already allowed 12 tight ends, 2 tight ends this year, and the next closest is the Jags, Jets, and Dolphins, who are tied with 7. The Bengals have allowed over 4 fantasy points more per game than the next closest team. I lean Jonnu, my favorite option. Patty Fry isn't too far behind. And then lastly, Noah Fant. I talk about him almost every week now that Joe Flacco is under center. Fant has scored a touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. And in week 7, when the Steelers and the Bengals played, he had 4 catches for 44 yards and a score for 14 PPR points. The Steelers struggle against opposing tight ends, allowing the 5th most PPR points to the position. Fant is a strong tight end 2 play for me this week. That being said, if you haven't already, hit the like, hit the subscribe button. If you have any questions, be sure to leave it in the comment section below. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.